because the stakes are so huge, they're off-putting. So then those who do actually see it for what it is and decide to pursue, it's going to be a tiny number of people.
It's going to be the people who have the financial resources and the ample amounts of time to sit down and think about these things. And that, I think, is the greatest obstacle that any sort of conversation.
Hold on, Andre. Who else would it be? Is it going to be the person that's working 3 jobs and hasn't had a chance to read a book in like 2 years?
Well, then I think the real problem is the fact that somebody has to work 3 jobs.
That is also why I'm saying we have to sort of transcend the gene agenda, evolutionary things that we have going on in us, because the complexity of the issue is instantaneously like, it's a deterrent. It's like, no, I'm not getting into that. That's in the future. That's not of my concerns right now.
And I still think you can talk about the Metacrisis in a way that is understandable to the average person, right? I mean, the way that Schmachtenberger talks about it is, I think, more targeted towards people that are going to be good candidates to come up with those more technical solutions. But to the wider population, maybe you really just need to dumb that down. I mean, you have to dumb that down.
I like the idea of identifying what specific expressions of the Metacrisis are most salient to the person you're talking to, like dating apps, microplastics in your testicles.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Radius of Reason. My name is Andre, and I am joined by my co-host, Livan.
Yeah, and the goal of today's episode is to understand what a grassroots movement aimed at addressing the Metacrisis could or should look like.
To help us in this discussion, we're joined by 2 guests today. You've met Alex before in previous episodes, and for the first time to the show, we'd like to welcome James. He is a content creator, regenerative farmer, and a grassroots activist.
Okay, James. How does one launch a movement aimed at addressing the greatest problems in the history of humanity without sounding like a delusional egomaniac?
Well, I think the idea of launching the movement is one question, but if a movement gains steam, I think the movement would have to be made up of people, individuals, all of who understand broadly all the different topics that make up the Metacrisis, and who each will, to a differing extent, understand each of the topics in some depth. Then coupled to that, you also need humans who can sort of call forth that warrior archetype within, for the perseverance, for the persistence, for the intelligence, for the strategizing about how to actually go about addressing the Metacrisis, but also call forth this archetype of the mystic, because these problems can be depressing and make people sad and just despair. So then what the mystic can do for you is provide you with the motivation, the energy sources, by playing with the more irrational aspects of who we are as humans. But those irrational aspects happen to also be quite motivating and energizing. So I think that's how I think we can address the Metacrisis, should a movement get going.
That sounds very, very elitist, but we're
going
we're gonna dig into that. But,
I can actually,
yeah. We'll definitely get into it. That'll be fun. Alex, go ahead.
I really enjoyed that, James. And I am personally familiar with the whole idea of these archetypes, but maybe you could expound on that for people who may not be familiar with those.
Hey, everybody. We'll get back to the show in just a second, but before that, Livan has a message for you all.
Help us out. We're poor. We need money for just $1 a day, or alternatively, a single subscribe will help us a lot. So do that.
Oh yeah. So I think humans as organisms are made up of, I think technically they're called of like autonomous complexes within. And obviously we label them certain things. So the warrior archetype he's known historically as literally the warrior with a sword, maybe on horseback, who cuts heads or whatever.
Word.
Yeah. So they're these sorts of, I don't know if you could also refer to them as like inner personalities that when they intermingle and discuss with each other, come to the fore in certain moments of our life or in certain contexts. So certain situations will require a certain archetype be brought up and embodied through your body.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so for example, if you find yourself in a conflict, you'll want to express certain patterns of behavior that are useful for conflict. If you find yourself in a situation that requires levity and joy, you'll need to bring forth other patterns of behavior that are useful for that context. Is that an accurate summary of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's how I'd see them.
Great.
The archetypes.
That's how I see them too.
Hmm.
I didn't know we were going to talk about these today, but I think that's a useful tool. Absolutely. When you're building communities, you got to keep in mind people's personalities and the way that you're expected to behave and the way you need to behave to accomplish certain goals.
But I guess maybe we will just address this quickly because it's a bit of an elephant in the room. Are you, to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, are you referring to a group of more or less elites that compose themselves of these necessary archetypes to drive the movement in question?
Yeah, I've never actually thought of it in terms of like elites and then non-elites, but I can see why that thought came to mind. What I'm speaking to is transcending the sort of default mode of how we humans are when we just run by like the gene agenda and just do the things that our, I don't know, most base selves compel us to do. So we need to somehow go above and beyond that. And I guess most, or maybe a lot of people won't be able to do that because they're too locked into that default mode. And so it's those people who can transcend that sort of gene agenda that I'm speaking to. Not necessarily elites, but it is.
It almost forms a new elite of its own. And I think that like the direct parallel we've seen in history with this is the concept of like the revolutionary vanguard that Lenin proposed when it comes to bringing about any sort of revolutionary movement, is that you have to have a group of people that are able to be the intellectual and maybe spiritual force behind any sort of political movement, a concept which I do disagree with. I want to emphasize. And I think that the question that I have in this kind of arrangement is, how would this not elite be kind of selected, right? How would we go about organizing a group of people that are able to bypass this sort of hierarchy to bring about like the organizational capability for everybody else? As in, how is that group of knowledgeable individuals of the Metacrisis supposed to come about if they are not personally anointing themselves into that kind of role?
Oh yeah, I think it is a process of self-selection, or you self-elect to become a part of this group. But I even hesitate to use the word group because instantly then we're into the idea of in-group, out-group, us versus them dynamics, where now I identify with this group. But that is itself also a problem of the default mode of this gene agenda I'm speaking to. It's like, no, you need to transcend this us versus them thinking and come into a different place altogether. Think about these things in a completely different way, almost like an alien. You can't really actually accept your default human ways. You need to look at it from a detached perspective and see, okay, hang on, what's actually going on here? What's actually going to work in terms of the actions we can take to address this problem or these problems, and go from there.
I think there's trade-offs though with that approach, because clearly there's advantages to the in-group out-group thing, which is why it evolved, right? And that's how we're naturally predisposed to think and to act in. But with what you're saying is you have to transcend that in order to maybe get to a higher level of consciousness and awareness of things. But when you do that, you are now fighting against nature, and you will potentially be outcompeted by philosophies that utilize the in-group, out-group narrative and sort of thinking. So my question to you would be, why not leverage the in-group, out-group, but try to do so in a way that maybe mitigates some of the drawbacks?
Leverage some of it, but mitigate the drawbacks. Yeah, I guess instantly the first thought that comes to mind when I hear about us versus them is, fully it was an evolutionarily advantageous thing to do back in the day when you had a socially cohesive in-group against an out-group who weren't as cohesive as your in-group, you beat them. And then you got to take their territory and eat their food and whatnot and win the game of life across evolutionary time. But I think, instantly the thought that comes up now in a modern context, if you were to fall into that mode of thinking once more, we don't have that luxury because technology is such that if we do fall into that mode of thinking and decide to violently attack or whatever the defined outgroup, then we have means by which we can annihilate the whole of the biosphere now.
Yeah, but it doesn't it beg the question that, why define things narrowly when if you can define the in group for this movement as the entire world, as the globe, then you've at least, in a pseudo intellectual manner have like bypassed not pseudo intellectual, but it in some level bypasses that narrative. But yeah, let's give Alex a chance to address that original question of like, how do you not sound like an egomaniac by proposing to fix all these great problems? And then maybe we can compare some ideas.
But Evan, let's come back to that idea, because now I get your idea of leveraging the evolutionary traits that we have within us and expanding it to the whole of the biosphere. Fully agreed.
We'll be right back. But first, Andre has a message to all politicians and world leaders and corporate CEO people.
Leaders of the world, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and give this video a like. Leave us a comment as well.
So I think every movement had to start with someone. And right now, there is a desperate need for some kind of community of people who are united around trying to solve this big problem. And I'm also someone who will advocate against elitism or trying to find a specific group of people who need to do this. I think the Metacrisis is humanity's problem, and as such needs to be addressed by everyone. It needs to be accessible to everyone. It's the human project, as far as I'm concerned, of the 21st century. And so I think whatever community is created around this, it needs to be open and accessible to anyone. So I think that's how you get around the whole egomania question. That's not about us. We're just four assholes on the internet who just happen to care about this. It's not.
Alex, how would you react to the notion that egomania would be necessary to address something like this? Is that it would not be with something as complex and contradictory as the concept of a metacrisis is? It almost feels at times that if you left it up to everybody's welcome, everybody can participate in the solution, you wouldn't actually be able to get anything done, because the problem that you're trying to address in itself is wildly complex. Right.
Sure.
I mean, we can't even fully organize around like patching up potholes and roads in certain cities globally. And we're talking about addressing like deep-rooted existential intersecting issues. So do those problems require the egomania and the force of will of an individual? And is it possible to avoid elitism in addressing these sorts of things?
I think you're just reinventing the third attractor, Andre. So the whole idea here is that egomania, or the whole idea of like centrality, like a single force who's able to most effectively solve the problem. That's one potential solution. And then you have your democratic solutions where everyone is involved and has their say, which has inefficiencies and other problems. And I think for a metacrisis community to be effective, you need to start working your way towards some other option. I think James is on the right track in that we need to figure out how to elicit the right patterns of behavior in people. He talks about the warrior archetype and like the king archetype and all those various ways that people are inspired to take action. I think that is an important ingredient in whatever movement is created. People need to be inspired. They need to be spurred to take action, to coordinate. It can't just be willy-nilly. Everyone's on just here and talking. There needs to be some kind of focus.
So I think we're at a good point where people are probably wondering, like, okay, they've said the words metacrisis, they've said the word movement, okay, but what exactly are they referring to? Like, what is this? So maybe we should take a moment to define what this movement could be in terms of its goals and ideas, right? And we know vaguely that the idea is to address all these global problems and to fix them and whatnot. But like that is obviously far too vague. So in a more concrete way, how can we define the main objectives of the movement and the ideas that it stands for?
Well, I think the most important thing is that people need to be brought together. That's like step 0 in any kind of effort to make change in the world. Like that's what Daniel Schmachtenberger did. He created the Consilience Project. He said, we don't really know exactly what we're going to do, but we're going to bring a bunch of people who are smart. We're going to bring them together and we're going to hash this out. And they just recently released the findings that they've made over the past several years of talking about these problems. And I think that kind of effort is step 0. Just finding your platform, finding your people, bringing them together and hashing it out. And then from there, you can figure out exactly what the next steps would be.
Yeah, I'd agree in that finding your tribe is 100% necessary to deepen your personal understanding of the issues at hand, but also the collective understanding among the tribe. But when it comes to defining a movement, I find it difficult because I actually don't think, and I know this will be in disagreement with some of you guys here, but I actually don't think that a movement is going to cut the mustard, is going to do the trick. And I'm not 100% on that, but just right now, as far as I'm aware and informed so far, maybe this conversation will change my view on the situation. I look around me and I look at all these movements, like the environmental movement, the Extinction Rebellion movement, the whatever other movement you want to speak to, and I see that these are ineffective. It makes people feel good to join up and like shout the slogans and all, but their ostensible goals are not being reached. It's not working. So I actually think what's needed is that like group of people who understand this at a deep level and a broad level, who can then go about taking effective action by actually laying out a stepwise plan, saying, here, this is what we're going to do, bang, 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 and then executing on those actions and adapting in the moment, because the group is small enough now to actually be able to pivot and adapt, because it's not so big that it takes weeks and weeks of negotiations and meetings to figure out where to go with this movement. So it may be like a micro-scale movement that I'm speaking to.
So let me maybe better understand what you're saying. So the oorah kind of flag waving, let's say the environmental movement.
Yeah.
Are you saying that it's too big and unwieldy to actually generate any effective change, because at that point it's just too many people participating and nobody really having a clear understanding of what their role is?
Yeah, that. But also I think that the movement itself has been co-opted by the very sort of power structures that it seeks to undermine, because it's just out in the open and it's letting everybody know its plans about how to go about preventing biodiversity loss and whatnot. And if preventing biodiversity loss comes at the cost of some corporations' profits, then the corporation is going to, because it is itself an evolved entity, it's going to figure out a way to suppress that and prevent that from happening, because its ultimate goal is profits. So yeah, it is. Sorry, go on.
No. Go ahead.
It is the fact that it's so big that the people themselves within the group don't necessarily all cotton on or agree to the same way of going about this movement. That there's a lot of different thinking in the minds of the people who are all involved in the movement. But it's also, it's so big that it's actually incapable of shifting and adapting when necessary.
Do you feel that maybe on a historical scale, like the largest changes that have been brought about for humanity have happened due to the actions of smaller groups that maybe command undue influence?
Yeah, well, here's the difficult thing, because the smaller groups tend not to get the publicity. But that being said, so you actually don't know. Like there's no history to describe this or explain it, unless of course you find like a niche historical book that does explain it. And actually, this calls to mind the idea of, I was at a conference in Prague a while back, and they mentioned like, okay, history is defined in terms of wars and whatnot, and these huge wars and these huge great characters like Napoleon and Alexander the Great and these people. But a lot of like the most disproportionately effective actions that humans have taken have gone unknown. So, for example, the guy, I forget his name now, actually, ironically, but the guy who created the cargo ship, the idea of a cargo ship, completely revolutionized international trade, and with that invention, but people don't know about it. But look at how disproportionately effective that single innovation was from the mind of a single man, and how it affected the world, and how little we know about it. So, yeah, I'm not sure if it's correct to say that big movements shape the course of history more so than smaller ones. But
we've talked about that to a certain extent, James. Like when we first started discussing solutions to the meta crisis, we looked at international organizations as a potential model for addressing this, right? And we considered the wildly ineffective approach of the UN in the past and today to stopping the mass slaughter of individuals, right? Like the concept of Rwanda, maybe what's happening in Gaza right this minute. But there was also a conversation we had over the effectiveness of much smaller international organizations like the International Telecommunications Union, which basically allows the free flow of data and information between countries, even if they're like warring with one another or not on speaking terms, or something even as simple as like the International Postage Union, where if you send a package today from Ireland to Ghana, it will get to Ghana, and there's an entire system working to ensure that that arrival happens. So I think to a certain extent you're correct in that maybe the large successes of human development, human history can be attributed to much smaller organizations that don't have as much of like a public face. With regards to the meta crisis, I feel like we're almost advocating for the establishment of like the Illuminati or something. That's it to that.
I think so. Here, I think there's maybe a little bit of confusion, or maybe it's just pure disagreement from my part. But I think you can still have a small group of people that are kind of doing work at a technical level that has a disproportionate impact. For example, maybe the Consilience Project with Schmachtenberger, maybe they come up with some sort of international coordination system that's far more effective than the UN. But they did the technical work to figure that out. But I think that's a different question than, do you have the political willpower now to enact such a system? Do you have a cultural enlightenment, which is what Schmachtenberger also talks about, that is really needed? That's the fundamental kind of like capital that you have for change is culture itself. And if you don't change the culture and you try to impose something top down and the culture is not ready to accept it, then you're going to have the same issues, right? They're going to overturn that. They're not going to understand that. They won't see the values. So there has to be a realignment of values. And I think you're not going to get that unless you have a broader movement. Again, that doesn't mean that the broader movement itself is the thing that has that disproportionate impact that you're talking about, James. However, could it be a movement that helps with messaging and education on the level of some of the values and propel some of the archetypes that you talked about, so that people are able to have that more compelling narrative, that emotionally charged narrative? Because you're right, on a purely intellectual level, it's going to be difficult to persuade a large swath of the population that this is a thing to do and whatnot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think we're in disagreement. I think we're just speaking to two completely different points. I was speaking to effective action and what actually brings about effective action and change. What you're speaking to is, like a cultural movement to change the values of people that would then, I wonder, make them more open to ideas and potential changes in their lifestyle that they otherwise wouldn't have been open to. And that would be necessary should we address the meta-crisis, those changes.
Perhaps any community or organization or movement that you create could, instead of being about the meta-crisis specifically, be about the cultural enlightenment that is required to then effectively address the meta-crisis.
I think, I don't know if we need to choose between the two. I think we can kind of have our cake and eat it too. And the reason I say this is because one of the things that I think can distinguish the meta-crisis movement from other movements, especially like the green movement that hasn't been very successful, we're using more fossil fuels than we ever have, all these, the chemicals in our environment just continue to saturate it. And so what I was thinking is, yeah, I just lost my train of thought, but now I regained it. So you give me a second here. I think one of the unique things about the meta-crisis movement is that what's inherent to it is the fact that our problem-solving mechanisms are flawed. So it does focus on the fact that our problem-solving itself is the issue. In fact, it is one of the issues that generates most of the new problems that we face. And so that approach, it's almost a kind of a recursive approach of saying, double check your methodology and double check the problems you're actually trying to solve before you actually try to solve them. And if you do decide you want to solve them, then do it in a way that takes a holistic systems, like a broad approach, as opposed to we're going to optimize for this narrow metric. And once we do, therefore we solve the problem, except no, you've externalized it to other domains. So I would break out the movement if I was going to define some of the main principles into three parts. So one would be the education, to say like, hey, we've got all these interconnected global issues, but they're also tied to very personal ones, like not just having microplastics in your testicles, but also dating apps are horrible for the dating market and for human social dynamics. All these things, like you can make it like a global thing and then also a personal one. And so that's one part, is the messaging and the education to the broad population. The other thing is, and this touches on what both James and Alex, you guys have mentioned thus far, it's how do you get beyond that kind of, is it right brain or left brain, whatever, the rational brain, and invoke emotion and also provide that spiritual element that I think all of us can agree on is missing in this more secular society, right? Like secularism has been, at least thus far, you could say it's in infancy on a historical timescale, but thus far it's been an abject failure when it comes to providing meaning and purpose in people's lives. So can this movement be construed in such a way as to help create and generate purpose for people, like fill that spiritual void? And what I'm thinking is, could it be like could the movement itself, and what I think about it is a more decentralized kind of local chapters, right? Something akin to like little churches, like a modern church, but not, for worshiping God, but for organizing around addressing organizing around, of course, the broader goals of the meta-crisis, but maybe specific things to that, local environment. But then also help build human-to-human connection. Like that's another thing, right? Like the loneliness crisis and tech and isolation. Can you somehow have that compounding benefit by saying, okay, like this is not only an organization that is educating people on this topic and trying to do some good, but also it's a place that anybody can go and have community. Maybe people do camping trips together and like try to reconnect with nature, maybe do some urban farming or whatever. Like, can this be that sort of new community center that emerges? The thing that's deeply lacking in the moment. And then finally, I think another tenet of this is like, you should see some action from this movement, right? It's not just about messaging. It's not just about creating a sense of purpose and community, but ultimately we have to acknowledge the fact that there's deep problems in our societies. We've absolutely trashed nature, right? We've just absolutely trashed it. And so what are things that we can do on a very concrete level to help the situation, right? It may be things as simple as cleaning up a lake or river. It could be as more systemic as trying to create a lobby organization that's going to rework the education system, right? I mean, again, it could be decentralized, unique to each geographic location, unique to the people that are in the organization and their talents and capabilities, but still fall within the broader Metacrisis purview of like, there's all these problems, plus let's reconnect with one another type of thing. Does that make sense? Is that maybe still too broad, or I don't know how that sounds from the outside?
I think it was simultaneously too broad and too narrow, but I agree with the broader point. So when you start talking about like cleaning up rivers and stuff, like that's already kind of, I think, missing the important part of the Metacrisis, which is the fact that we have systemic problem-solving issues. the microplastics in the environment are like
In the
downstream.
testicles, Alex. In the testicles.
Yes, in the testicles. Yes.
Don't forget.
Or that's all downstream of the Metacrisis. So whatever movement you create about the Metacrisis, if it's just cleaning up lakes and rivers, it's just another environmental movement.
I agree. No, that's a great point. I was completely wrong. And
Sure,
you're absolutely right about that.
But I think this is why it's important to have a group of people who, we, while we're hashing ideas out, we can say, "Oh, actually, this I would do it this way instead." We can have that dialogue, that back and forth, to make sure that we're all staying on the same page.
James, what I wanted to loop you in on, and maybe this is the ultimate guiding light of why we invited you on our show to begin with for the audience. You have experience in starting projects up in what, broadly speaking, we'd call it grassroots activism, right? Tapping into your experience and tapping into how you've gone about your course of work, what has proven successful, right? I mean, so maybe to structure the question for a bit more, could you identify a problem that you've worked on and what steps you've taken to start getting a solution off the ground?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I have experience in meeting people who themselves have experience in getting effective grassroots. I wouldn't call them movements going, but effective grassroots, maybe nuclei around which movements can evolve. Yeah. So one example is I was on a farm in Galicia, and I wonder if this is connected, but hear me out. So I was on a farm in Galicia, and this lad decided to put terraces in, and terraces are like an agricultural technology which make farming slopes possible. So you get to increase your caloric yield from your piece of land per meter squared of land that you have. But terraces are not like culturally a thing in Galicia, in this place in Spain. They are, however, in the south. And so his neighbors, who were all native Spaniards and all older because he's out in the countryside and it's pretty much only old people out there, were all like, "That's so weird. What are you doing?" But he continued to do it anyway, and now they see the value in this. And now maybe going forward, if ever there comes a time where terraces become necessary to increase caloric yield for a given locality, they at least now have exposure to that thanks to this farmer in Galicia who decided to bring this foreign technology onto his land, despite it not being looked upon in a good light by the neighbors. And so that, I don't know, I think he could be the catalyst for the grassroots movement that you're maybe speaking to here to address the problems of that particular region anyway, that local area.
Interesting. Yeah. And well, and also maybe to emphasize, like, how did this individual go about? I mean, was he local to the Galician community, or how did he earn the trust and the interest of the people surrounding him that they would actually follow through with this sort of innovation?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because this lad actually had hired in also a permaculture consultant who himself was very knowledgeable on all this stuff. And one of his main points, which you wouldn't really consider a main point from a permaculturalist, is when you go to a new area, make sure to integrate with the neighbors. Go around and ask them about how they do what they do. And this way you get to build a relationship and also show that you're actually interested in how they do what they do, because how they do what they do in that area is probably useful for you to know, because you're a foreigner coming in. You don't know how this land works and how things work around here. So it's good to get that knowledge. But
Well, no, go ahead.
No, go. What was the question again? I completely.
Well, the question was I guess now that you've identified it, what would you apply to a greater approach to grassroots activism from that point, to getting something off the ground? And it sounds like the first tenet here is also like local context is very important.
Yeah,
obviously.
Yeah.
But if we were to deploy any form of like local Metacrisis chapter, like Laban was talking about, I mean, why in the hell would anybody want to listen to a bunch of guys that sit around discussing these things and then decide to move to Galicia to start combating the Metacrisis, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I suppose it'd be good to ask ourselves that question, like what draws us to the Metacrisis, and then maybe extrapolate out.
No, I mean, it is a fair question, and I think that's where you have to kind of form a compelling narrative if you want to message the I guess the most fundamental starting point is, do you care about these problems happening in our world? And I think all of us care about it. So the next step is like, what do I do about it, right? And so thus emerges like the idea of like, well, we should tell other people about it. Like that's the human intuition is like, shit, I got to tell people. Like, okay, and obviously, there's the green movement. There's various movements that are more or less trying to do this. You could say there's already a sort of meta-crisis movement in terms of what Schmachtenberger has done, what Nate Higgins has been doing. Like that's more or less a sort of movement. But could you, like, if you were someone who was like, this is still not reaching nearly enough people, and I want to genuinely like get a big ass megaphone out and reach everyone on the planet, as many people as I can, because this is so important. What do I do? And I think this is kind of where we're looking at this and saying, what would the most effective way to message this be in terms of a movement? And it's like, well, step one, I think, would be to create. Step one is to define what the movement is, which we kind of sort of touched on. But then the next step is like, how do you create a compelling narrative out of that? Like, how do you frame things in terms of people's self-interest, right? Because people don't genuinely give a fuck about anything other than things that are more or less directly impacting them. And I'm going to use myself as an example for this, okay? So, I have plans to go to Banff National Park in Canada. And I don't know if people are familiar, but it's one of the, it's the most popular national park in Canada. And a few hours north of it is Jasper National Park, which is also one of the most popular parks in Canada and also gorgeous and everything. Booked everything, hotels last Sunday. Monday, there's a wildfire in the park. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'll keep tabs on it.
Okay.
Yeah. And then a few days later, my brother sends me a photo of like this burning building in Jasper, in the town of Jasper. And it turns out that's the hotel that we had booked to go to. And so it burned to a crisp. That entire national park, is like wildly devastated. Half the town burned down. Horrible. But of course, the reason I care so much about it and continue to think about it on an emotional level, not because I'm a psychopath or anything, but that's just how humans work, is because I have plans to go there, right? And it sounds horrible, but it's also, maybe the first time that climate change, is directly impacting me, in such a blunt way, impacting my finances, my direct plans. And so it got me thinking, like, okay, we have to kind of frame this in a way that's as captivating as possible. And now, obviously, that's going to be difficult because, my situation's a little different, but it is related, to climate change, which is part of the metacrisis, because the lack of coordination, it's a lack of acknowledging that this energy, this fossil fuels that we use, is absolutely shitting on the environment, creating massive changes that are terrible for humans. And of course, you can link wildfire frequency and size to climate change. So that would be like my first big thing is, what narrative can we create that appeals to people's self-interest and also urgency, because it is a time-sensitive thing, right? Climate changes, all these chemicals that are accumulating in our environment, like that, those things are kind of, urgent. And so let me ask you guys, what do you think would be a great way to frame this that can draw people more to it?
And I think this is where what James is talking about fits in perfectly. Because I think bringing in local context is always going to be absolutely necessary for anything. So if you're going to be organizing any sort of quote unquote like metacrisis movement, whatever the fuck that means, it's going to have to be immediately attached to the scenario that's most relevant to the community in which you're organizing in. So in this case, again, the proverbial Galician farmers, a metacrisis movement would only be successful if it addresses the issues through a lens that which they see them. So maybe, again, the issue of climate change, it's causing certain crop yields to go down. So maybe there's a concern about the ability to continue in like a livelihood that they have, whatever. And I think every single community at any like global scale is going to have a set series of top 3 major things that are impacting them that will inevitably always have an overarching umbrella of the metacrisis that influences it. I think climate change is probably going to be the most evident one because that's the one that we're experiencing the most in the most kind of alarming fashion. Things like nuclear warfare, it's all, I don't know if you could find somebody on the street of New York City and attach, one of their anxieties directly to that. But climate change, I think, would be the most adept issue to grapple with in that sense. So I think any form of grassroots organizing has to stem from the problems that the community in focus has. And without that knowledge and without that context, messaging is going to be absolutely flat and completely irrelevant, in my opinion.
There are 2, as I see it, necessary preconditions for any movement to succeed. Number 1 is understanding of the problem, the education, like Levon talked about. And then there's caring about the problem. In this case, that basically means caring about all of humanity actually solving this. And I can't begin to tell you how many misanthropists and doomers I have encountered in this community around people discussing the metacrisis. Tons of people, probably a solid 10% of everyone I've met in like YouTube comment sections or Discord groups about the metacrisis and adjacent ideas. They are either resigned to our fate of extinction, or they even potentially welcome it, thinking that we deserve it. And you're not going to get anywhere with that mindset. So I think the 2 broad prongs needs to be education and instilling the value that this is worth solving. It's worth trying. Humanity is pretty cool, and I happen to be one of them. So I'm interested in fixing the issue.
Okay, so, but in terms of what Andre's talking about, when it comes to, say, a local chapter that you're trying to start up, we're kind of toggling between the broad metacrisis narrative and the more local concrete example of the
you-
manifestation of one of those Metacrisis themed things.
Yeah.
So, in terms of that balance at a local level, like, I mean, maybe you can speak to that a little bit more, Alex, like how one would achieve that.
Oh, well, I think it's important that people run experiments to see what works and what doesn't. But I have really liked your plans, Levon, for going to like local colleges and discussing the issue with people there. I think that is an important component of education, and that's a very localized thing. Yeah, I think the important thing, if you want to actually discuss the details of a local chapter and how that would differentiate from other local chapters, you can't really predict that. You have to actually get the thing going and get the local people involved so they can actually discuss it. Yeah.
The decentralization of this movement, if you were to approach it with like, hey, we're going to have local chapters that are trying to address things locally within the broader principles and so on and so forth, I think it begs the question of like, okay, so but is there an overarching kind of formal process for like creating this chapter? Is there a group of people that are like heading the movement, like maybe a group of elites or archetypes that James talked about?
Yeah.
Like is there like because by decentralizing, you obviously run the risk of like reduced coordination, right? That's the trade-off that you're making versus like a centralized approach. So how do you guys think that could work? Like, do you still need a kind of head of the snake type of thing, or is head? I don't know if that's a good analogy. Let's ignore that. That was stupid. But does this thing need a head, or could you have it act more or less independently and kind of coordinate just kind of at will as opposed to through a more structured process?
Hey, man. I think the meta treaty model that we created a while back would be a fun experiment to run at to run an organization.
You just love patting yourself on the back, don't you?
Self-congratulatory.
Hey, maybe it's entirely bullshit. I don't know, but I would love to try it out.
What is it? The meta treaty fact.
Levon, would you like to do the honors?
Yeah, I mean, so we originally created this idea of a meta treaty model to establish kind of a new, more or less, replacement for the UN. So some sort of international coordination system, but one that suits the vision of a third attractor that Daniel Schmachtenberger has talked about, which is kind of this happy medium between decentralization, which can lead to chaos, and centralization, which leads to authoritarian dystopias.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the primary principles in that model was the way you elect these assemblies of decision makers is through a random draft, more or less. Now, there's some caveats, like, there should be some qualifications, so it's not just anyone per se, right? But more or less, each person in society, each adult member is eligible to be a part of this draft, and then they get drafted through a random process that might occur on a digital platform that's fully transparent, open source type of thing. And then that bypasses some of the issues with democracy and elections, because democracies are more or less popularity contests. And although that worked back in the day when we had small tribes and everybody knew each other, doesn't really work at the scale that we have now, because you just have sociopaths and charismatic individuals manipulate the population, lie, whatever, and get the power and then not do anything they said. And it's really is it better than kings and monarchies and shit? Yeah. Is it the best that humans can do? I'm not convinced about that. So this is just an alternative model, just an idea, just a thought experiment. But that's kind of one of the main goals, is how do you elect decision makers? Well, you randomly draft a pool of qualified individuals, and then you bypass a lot of those bad incentives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and this has precedent. It's in the there's a system called sortition, which is a form of election, which is basically what this is. So it's been talked about and is advocated for by some of my favorite political theorists and economists. But as far as like how you want to structure these chapters, I would say like the most important thing is that there's common knowledge and a common platform for people to coordinate on. Because if you end up with a bunch of different chapters with different ways of communicating, that just falls apart. So there needs to be some kind of shared knowledge and shared conversation mechanisms.
And again, it's James, like one of the things we initially talked about was like probably the most successful international organization that has effectively like achieved its ends, even if the ends are cynical, is the Catholic Church, where, you know, global presence, multicultural presence, all adhering to a doctrine that's established by a central authority that is then distributed through localized quote unquote chapters, if you will, right?
Okay.
And inevitably speaking, almost every conversation we've had, they're in the vacuum of like, well, how could we possibly create this kind of organization? In my mind, at least, I'm like, oh, like it's right there. Everything is already there, because the Catholic Church in rural Arkansas is going to have a hierarchy of allegiance that eventually falls to the Vatican. And the Vatican will say something, and then that small ass church in rural Arkansas is likely going to adhere to that.
Yeah.
You know, and if you don't, well, that's how you had all the various schisms that happened throughout the history of Christianity.
Uh-huh.
Probably preaching to the choir here. Do you think that model is successful? As somebody that lives in a country,
Ireland, yeah, Jesus, we're fully taken over by that whole model. Yeah, yeah, no doubt it's successful. But yeah, as you say, to what ends? Okay, so then with these meta treaty elected people or drafted people, would they all be? I don't know if this is what you were speaking to, Alex, but would they all be versed in the Metacrisis ideas and knowledge? Is that the common knowledge?
Absolutely,
Well,
absolutely.
Can I add something, Alex? So,
Sure.
in the context of if you were trying to apply this meta treaty model to this movement, I think it would be like you might draft individuals from several chapters to come together, you know, form a general assembly and give direction, at least temporarily, you know, maybe for a specific task. Because one of the other principles of this meta treaty model is like, you don't have these people stay in power indefinitely. They're constantly like cycled through to prevent corruption from taking hold, which invariably would, right? So, but anyway, like you would kind of more or less draft, you know, certain candidates, and initially you would just have people probably self-elect because you wouldn't really have a movement, right? Like there has to be like a first mover type of thing. But yeah, they could come together and they could set some basic guidelines, and then you could maybe repeat the process every year, right? So like, hey, these are the core tenets. These are the things we're doing well, or we're going to move to this platform now. Maybe originally it starts out as like a group chat, like a WhatsApp group chat, and then next, like it's on a Discord server, and then next you've got your own website and your forum, you know, like that's the kind of maybe centralizing piece, because there has to be, I would think, for an effective movement, there has to be some way for these decentralized entities, these chapters, to coordinate, right? There has to be something and share that common knowledge base and objectives that Alex spoke to.
Right, because I don't think a third attractor is. I think the third attractor moniker is a bit of a misnomer. I don't think it's some separate secret third thing. I think it's just a nuanced combination of centralized and decentralized structures. I don't think it's going to be a single thing on its own. So you'll have elements of centralization in the third attractor system.
Any objections, Andre, James? They're just staring at us like, what the fuck are they talking about?
No, I think I'm getting it.
Yeah. So carry on.
I think, to my mind anyway, and back to the question about how do you actually convey to people the meta-crisis narrative and have them see it for what it is and see it for something that, if not at least now is affecting their life, will affect their life. I think such a system like the Meta Treaty Pact would have to develop in parallel with what's being run right now, because what's being run right now, at least to the average person, is good enough. Their basic needs are met, and they don't have any major problems beyond, interpersonal relationships and whatnot. So it would have to develop in parallel with that. And then I think the only way you're going to get people to actually hear the Metacrisis message is when those direct negative impacts are felt and experienced, at which point the narrative will be heard, listened to, and then the actions that stem from it could be executed.
Do you think that the Metacrisis concept is too complicated?
Yeah.
Do you think you would just lose? I think you brought about a very valid point that people aren't going to give a shit until they give a shit. By the time they give a shit, they're going to care about, hey, why are my streets flooded? They're not going to care about some fucking dude with a beard that appeared in a podcast at some point. Not you, James. I'm talking about Schmachtenberger.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, all of these terms and phrases, and one of the things that's driven me a little bit crazy about the Metacrisis, even though it's an interesting framework to consider, is that it's adopting its own language. And the language makes sense to this weird little perverted podcast community we're in, but it probably won't mean much when it comes to addressing, a rising sea level sweeping an entire country off the face of the earth. So, I mean, what do we do about language? What do you think, James? Is it just is it helpful to even dribble around these concepts? Is it going to be effective in trying to communicate with a mass of people?
Yeah, well, this is it. I think it's very complex to understand the Metacrisis. Jesus, I've been studying it now for I don't know how many years, and I still think I barely know anything about this. And I can barely even speak to the topics and ideas I'd like to speak to. I have these thoughts about it, and it's clear in my mind, but then to be able to voice those thoughts is a different story. So even trying to get over that, and
that's where Schmachtenberger comes in.
I know his articulation is unbelievable, and everything he says, I'm just yeah, and then I'll stop the video or whatever and try to repeat what he said. Good luck. I have no chance, even though I agree with everything he just said. But so I think it's too complex. Well, not too complex. I think the human mind is extremely powerful, but that is also why I'm saying we have to sort of transcend the gene agenda, evolutionary things that we have going on in us, because the complexity of the issue is instantaneously it's a deterrent. It's no, I'm not getting into that. That's in the future. That's not of my concerns right now. I have these immediate concerns that I have to deal with, and so I'm not going to get into that. So we have to kind of rise above that the discount rate of, okay, things in my immediate concerns, yes, they may be my immediate concerns, but this thing that I would usually just not even pay attention to, I think I have to pay attention to it because it's so huge in its magnitude and its potential effects on me as an individual, me as a community, me as the globe in the future. And that's also why I say it's not an elitist thing, but it's also why I don't think most people are going to be able to step up to that challenge, because the stakes are so huge, they're off-putting. So then those who do actually see it for what it is and decide to pursue, it's going to be a tiny number of people of all the people on the earth.
And I agree with you. And I think my greatest fear about that is the tiny number of people is going to come from a particular class. It's going to be the people who have the financial resources and the ample amounts of time to sit down and think about these things. And that, I think, is the greatest obstacle that any sort of conversation.
Hold on, Andre. Who else would it be? Is it going to be the person that's working 3 jobs and hasn't had a chance to read a book in 2 years?
Well, then I think the real problem is the fact that somebody has to work 3 jobs. I think we're not doing ourselves a service by perpetuating whatever hierarchies already exist and trying to address this. I think that you inevitably hit the issue very, very directly up front. Is that who else is it going to be? Not the guy with 3 jobs, and that's the problem.
It's the chicken or the egg problem, though, that you've just created.
This is going back to my remarks an episode or 2 back when I said that honestly one of the most important things I think people who care about the Metacrisis can do is advocate for things like UBI and universal health care and better job security. Because that's it's just like you said, Levon, people who are working 3 jobs or we're living paycheck to paycheck just can't care about this And I think that's going to be a surprising number of people.
And it does feed into what James was talking about with regards to you may need a more targeted, like focused group, like an Illuminati, quote unquote, if you will, that's going to be able to address some of these things in order for it to actually be effective. Because I believe, James, the way you framed it is that true effectiveness happens kind of more behind the scenes, removed from what the experience of like all of humanity is going through.
And that's where I think you make that distinction again, where you do have the more when I say so, privileged people that have the time and also the right intent. And I think we can sometimes tell when people are kind of just full of shit or doing things for their own benefit. Although sometimes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions type of thing. But like more or less, like if we look at the ideas themselves and we say these are good ideas, I don't care who it comes from. I don't care if it comes from people who are in Silicon Valley or in India or in Brazil. I don't give a shit where the idea is coming from. If it's a good idea, let's support it. So, and if it happens to be the case that the people who have the most time on their hands are the ones who are the most privileged that are developing these ideas, I don't care as long as it's good, but let's vet the idea for what it is and not from where it necessarily came from. Although I completely understand the skepticism that Andre's talking about because the track record is not necessarily great. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, and as we sort of touched on, you do need to realign the values of the wider culture, and that's where that broader movement, that's where the more digestible ideas that you can feed to the broader population can have its place, and I still think you can talk about the Metacrisis in a way that is understandable to the average person, right? I mean, the way that Schmachtenberger talks about it is, I think, more targeted towards people that are going to be good candidates to come up with those more technical solutions, right? Because he's talking about it at such a high level with such precision, data, reason, logic, like all these things. Like, yes, that has its place, but to the wider population, maybe you really just need to dumb that down. I mean, you have to dumb that down, right? And it could be like, hey, the Metacrisis is basically all these problems. They're kind of interconnected. They have to do with how we're solving the problems, which isn't effective. And so we need to take a more holistic approach. Like people can kind of understand the general vibe of that. And then maybe, like we talked about, you target the specific things happening in their community from the Metacrisis perspective, right? So now they have something that's self-interest, something that they can relate to in their particular community, and something that's more dumbed down, but not compromising on the overall, principle and message. So it doesn't have to be this super abstract, 3-hour Schmachtenberger dissection of what's wrong with the progress narrative and how we need the third attractor and this and that term and whatnot. We don't need to go into the Habermas method and how synthetic fertilizer is creating dead zones in the ocean, and we can talk about it, but we don't have to. We can reframe it in a way that's more palatable, more or less.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of identifying what specific expressions of the Metacrisis are most salient to the person you're talking to, like dating apps, microplastics in your testicles. Like maybe create a grab bag of like 10 different such examples, and then just use the one that most resonates with the person you're talking to in order to illustrate the issue.
Free microplastic removal from testicle, like booth. Like you just set that up. Sponsored by the Metacrisis.
Sponsored by the Concilians Project.
We're doing this out in the open, in public. Yeah. I mean, it has to be that way, right? But that compelling narrative, I think, is what that is the most difficult part. Like marketing is obviously just so fundamental, especially in our current capitalistic global environment. Like you have to figure out how to market this. And right now the marketing is not good enough, right? It's way too narrow. It's way too abstract. And it's way too difficult for the average person to comprehend. So that might be maybe the first focus, right? The first item on the agenda of any sort of chapter that's forming around this issue. Say, how the hell do we market, not just the overall Metacrisis message, but the thing that is pertinent to our local community. So I don't know. That's difficult. But I mean, what you said, James, at the beginning is so important, because the idea of having these archetypes and trying to leverage people's emotions, that is, it's part of the wider Metacrisis issue of like a loss of meaning, and so it's almost
Everything
like
is part of the Metacrisis.
yeah, all these problems are like interconnected. Like, it's weird.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I think if we could create some sort of pseudo-religious, framework that might, again, go back to what Andre was saying, like with the Catholic Church. It's like, if you could remove the dogmatism, right, and the idea of God, but then you totally, you negate.
Well,
Yeah, you have to replace that with
wait.
something.
Why don't we explore a little bit the point James made about you have to kind of work either in coexistence or in parallel with existing institutions that are already seen as kind of good enough. Could we actually attach this kind of movement to a religion? Could we, in fact, co-opt something like the Catholic Church to start promoting some of these views within their existing like hierarchy and infrastructure? Because I mean, in many ways, like some of the most active anti-war groups are Catholic activist groups, especially around like nuclear weapons. They, see it as an existential threat from like a religious dogmatic scale, that no human is able to eliminate another human because they are not God. So therefore, they take a position of being anti-nuclear weapons. I'm sure there are, a number of religious groups that probably have a position on climate change as well. So instead of trying to, Livan, you keep on saying we need to have this sort of like a religious kind of institution that could bring people together. Like, why not just work, to James's point, with the hierarchy that already exists to bring about at least the initial pushes for some of these, levels of awareness.
Well, in the U.S., the existing institutions, the religious ones, are climate denialists. So, I mean, I don't know. I just think the base reasoning in religious thinking is inadequate. I just think you need something that maps onto reality better than a religious framework. So that's just my opinion.
Yeah, and existing institutions, as important as they are for you to be able to coordinate with them, none of them are going to have the holistic view that is required to move all these various initiatives forward. And if a church's particular view on a particular topic comes into conflict with another aspect of the holistic picture, that can be a big problem, and I can foresee that happening pretty easily.
Andre, is there a like non-religious movement in history that you think has been very successful?
Well, very successful, maybe not quite, but I think to supplant religion directly, I mean, the Soviet Union did exactly that. Is that you took an exceptionally religious, conservative series of countries, and then you injected kind of a religious ideology into them that effectively mimicked all of the iconography and ceremony of maybe what people were used to in terms of religion. And I guess the question of, was the Soviet Union successful? Well, ultimately, no, because it's not around. Did it alter the course of history? Yes. Did it ruin a lot of people's lives? Yes. Did it also achieve major breakthroughs in science and technology? Yes. And that was all done without the direct influence of God or church. It was all done through a secular state. And, this point you're making about having like a community center where people can gather to like, either engage in work or to relax and interact with others and debate. I mean, there was that concept of like a cultural pavilion or like a town hall that was like the centerpiece of a Soviet town located in location X, Y, and Z within the Soviet Union. So, I mean, it's not to say that it was a successful concept. And I think many times I have to like always put the earmark that in no way am I advocating for the return of anything like that. But we do have an example of something like that taking fold in history and achieving some ends, although through very, very brutal and unkind methodologies to a certain extent. But from a standpoint of success, if you had to point to anything, that in the span of maybe 10, 20 years, the Soviet system took a completely backwards agrarian society and like morphed it, dragged it in a very bloody fashion into one of the most advanced industrial societies on the planet at the time, without the influence of the church. So it is possible. But
Yeah.
Go ahead, James.
And then there's that other example. I'm not sure if you came across this guy on the Great Simplification podcast, but his name is Thomas Bjorkman. And he wrote a book called The Nordic Secret. I've yet to read it, but he describes it as the Scandinavian countries were, because you reminded me when you said like backward agrarian cultures, the Scandinavian cultures were that in 19th or maybe, 19th century. So they weren't keeping up with the industrialization and globalization of the world at the time, which was what nations, countries were shooting for.
Mm-hmm.
But then, so what the Nordic secret was that they created these schools where they would teach like inner development goals, but also teach about the movements of the world at the time. I don't mean movements like social movements. I just mean the way the world was kicking on in terms of industrialization. And these schools sort of upskilled the population of people. They would stay there for like 6 months or 9 months at a time. And it was kind of spiritual plus just learning about how to operate in the world. And in that way, they actually made the Scandinavian countries what they are today. These fairly wealthy, nice countries. So it's just another example of how to achieve certain ends, not necessarily through the Soviet way, but this Nordic secret way.
I think that's a great example. I think that's a phenomenal example. This is an example, I think, that relies on centralized like funding or a focus that, hey, we're going to create these sorts of school systems or education opportunities. And I agree with that kind of model. I think that's exactly what we would need to make any sort of movement successful.
Yeah, I think focusing on the education system is, for me, and we kind of touched on this, I think, in one of the previous Metacrisis discussions, but to me, that's the first thing that you need to change, because the wider culture just has to be more intellectually aware of things happening and more involved in politics to be able to create the systemic changes that are ultimately required. And if you don't have that base population that's equipped, doesn't matter what your system is, doesn't matter what you're proposing, nothing matters. You're screwed. The other thing I think it does by focusing on education, although an argument can be made that it's not urgent enough, because it would take, a generation or two at least to make the necessary, like once you change the education system, right, the effects would be so delayed that it's not clear that it would be sufficient, time-wise, although at this point, we're already past the brink climate change-wise, so I don't know. It's a matter of like mitigation and adaptation at this point, right? It's not really like you're not preventing some of the worst things or some of the bad things from happening. But I think by focusing on the education system, the other thing I think it allows you to do is, and this is something you mentioned at the beginning, James, is like you have these existing institutions and corporations that, if a movement goes against their self-interest, they're going to try to, wipe out, try to, propagandize, propagandize against it in a certain way, throw all their money at it. But by going to the education system and working to improve these broader, more fundamental things like critical thinking and maybe systems thinking. Like, I think systems thinking should be fundamental in schools. Those kind of things. By focusing on that, you're not directly, doing a thing that raises like a red flag to say Exxon or Google or Facebook, right? Like, oh, they're not really coming after us, right? They're just making people a little bit maybe smarter. I don't know. We don't know. Whatever. The education system, we're so far away from it. But like over time, in theory, people will recognize, oh shit, like there's so many bad incentives here, and they're exploiting us, and they're manipulating our attention, and so on and so forth. So it's almost like an indirect approach. It's just, as I mentioned, like the big question would be, is it too slow of a process?
If I may interject about education, reforming the education system doesn't necessarily have to be about public schools or private schools or any kind of formal school system. People don't really get their education from schools. That's just not how it really works. Like when you're an adult, when was the last time you guys attended a school class? And when was the last time you listened to a podcast?
But I mean, it's also what kinds of classes are made available to you as an adult, right? And is there like a concerted effort to even provide continuing education classes?
I mean, there's
to the point James was making about the Nordic secret. This is an approach that the Scandies took. Where are we allowed to say Scandi? Is that okay?
Don't know. Sounds good.
It sounds kind of offensive, but
let's reclaim it.
They did formalize and create adult education centers, and this feeds into what Yvonne was talking about, where as opposed to continued alienation, it forces people to come together in a physical space. So you're not consuming content in a solitary format.
I fully support all initiatives to make our public education systems better, but I think the juice there is not worth the squeeze. I think the most important thing you can do for education is just getting out there and making the message accessible and as widely heard as possible.
Education, the education of what though? I'm not sure you're on the same page here.
Yeah, so. Systems thinking, the Metacrisis, like environmental issues, all of it. Like everything you would want taught in the classes you're talking about, you can also relay through other channels and channels that people do listen to already.
It's a good point in the sense that, right now we're seeing with, like podcasts are obviously growing in popularity.
They're huge.
Since Joe Rogan's, rise, like there's been, Jordan Peterson has like 9 million followers. Like all these people are just massive followers. People are getting their news from alternative media now. Yes. And unfortunately, the likes of Jordan Peterson are getting funded by, fossil fuel companies. And so they're funneling anti-climate propaganda. So we're losing that battle, but it is a great point because it's so high leverage, right? Because everything is, in the digital realm, it is to your great disadvantage from a game theory standpoint to not utilize that tool, right? And so although, I think, Andre, you mentioned this in a prior episode, like podcasting's not going to cut it, but not on its own, but I think it could be a necessary component. And that's part of the reason why we're doing this podcast. That's the reason I'm sure Schmachtenberger goes on all sorts of podcasts to talk about it. That's the reason, James, that you launched your channel, I'm sure, to try to do something. And so you're right, Alex. Like it's a good thing to utilize these additional channels of, knowledge and education. And maybe we need a disproportionate effort in that domain as well. But I do think like you do want to maintain the human to human thing. And that should be an emphasis of any Metacrisis movement, in my opinion, because that detachment is part of the problem. So you don't want to just feed the monster totally, but you may have to feed it partially to get it to help you out.
So on the topic of coordinating with existing institutions, to back up a little bit on that, I would say the way I see it, there are three broad meta problems. three prongs of addressing this issue that make it harder to talk about this issue and harder to spread the issue. Three things that I think would make it easier. One is the education portion, which we just kind of hashed out a little bit. People need to know about the problem. They need to be able to think about the problem effectively. They need to know like the ins and outs of these problems. Two, they need to have the ability to spend time thinking about that problem, which is where things like economic safety nets come in. So economic safety nets in the form of like UBI and universal healthcare, things that allow the population to better engage with more highfalutin thinking. And then the third thing that I think is really important to address is election reform. Hashing out how to prevent lobbyists from being in control of everything and how to prevent our elections from perverting the interests and values of society. And if you can attack those three things, education, safety nets, and elections/government, I think any improvements in those three domains will make it easier for society to start actually engaging with the meta crisis. And I think any effective movement should focus on those three things. And you could partner with existing institutions that already do advocate for those things. So that's just my stream of consciousness thoughts so far. Feel free to disagree or jump in or add.
I think that's where the decentralized chapters would come into play, where, you know, if you've got a chapter in DC, you're probably going to be more politically focused, right? But part of the responsibility of all chapters, I think, is to, again, educate the broader populace about the wider narrative. And then I think once people understand that, that should, in theory, help in terms of electing decision makers that are more likely to do things like election reform.
But
of
it almost
course, there's
seems
so
like
many
we're not
bad
advocating
incentives
for,
there. But
it's like we're not advocating for education; we're advocating for propaganda, right? Is that we're not advocating to teach people critical thinking skills or, you know, develop and foster somebody's appetite to read and ingest new materials.
Oh, I would advocate for that.
So I think that's what we need to be clear about is that when we talk about education, we're not talking about teaching the meta crisis. We're talking about rounding out one's aptitudes so that they might seek it out for themselves. And I think it's both. And that maybe the meta crisis is, if it is truly this like existential issue, that anybody who has a foundation of critical thinking and curiosity will eventually come to the conclusion naturally and organically that this is
unfortunately there is no natural and organic anymore because there's so much propaganda. But I think you want to equip an individual with those skills, but then I think there's still the hard work of like, you have to compete against oil money, big tech money, big agro money, and so on and so forth.
And that is why I think it has to be attached to things like public schools and working within those channels and working to invest attention into that. Because on the public school hierarchy, you are not competing with big money and agro. And if you are, that is either done transparently, because the second institution gets involved in government, and public schools are an expression of government, that has to be made clear, right? And I think if you keep it attached to the state, that means everything can fall under the hierarchy of audit and compliance. And you'll be able to push back against any form of interference by outside interest to a certain extent.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I wouldn't. I would support that. However, I think it's also worth pushing back a little bit on the obviousness of the problem to anyone of sufficient intelligence. I think, like James earlier talked about how he has a really good grasp inside his head about this problem, but anytime he tries to articulate it, it's really tough. And I'm in a very similar boat. And also, I consider myself to be probably more intelligent than average. But when
How
But
dare you.
it wasn't. It wasn't until I read Scott Alexander's blog post, Meditations on Moloch, that I realized the extent of this problem. And it's a very insidious issue. And I think it's really easy. It's a really slippery issue. To use another fancy jargon word, it's kind of anti-mimetic. It's very difficult to think about. It resists anyone thinking about it because it's just it's so broad. It's so holistic. It's almost too big. It's so easy to miss the forest through the trees. And when you're really intellectual, you're really good at looking at trees. And I think it's important to just make a goalpost here saying, just flagging this, that I don't think sufficient intelligence and sufficient critical thinking are quite enough to get someone naturally to understand this issue.
And that means the issue is not being communicated clearly enough. That means it's not an issue in the individual, it's an issue in the message. Because that means organizations are doing a poor job.
That's not necessarily true. It could just be a very complex message. It could be complex by nature, right? And so
that means the messengers. That means the messengers of that message aren't doing an adequate job.
Well, I think both. No, but I mean, you wouldn't have to pick one. I mean, both things could be true. Like, it could be communicated better, but also it could be the fact that the whole point of, like, what Alex is saying is, because we're so narrowly focused. And the part of the Metacrisis theme is, like, you need to zoom out and consider the whole, but that's so unintuitive because it's so overwhelming and vague to start off with. Like, you know, that's part of the reason, like, the idea of reductionism is so appealing, especially from a scientific standpoint, and even from an economic standpoint. It's like you reduce things down to, like, a couple of variables, like GDP is a measure of economic growth, and let's optimize that. Well, okay, you've simplified it to the point that it's digestible. However, it's now perversely used as the metric, and anything that contributes to it is good. Well, it turns out, like, thus not necessarily in line with human well-being. So that's part of the problem, is how human beings tend to think is non-holistically, because it is by definition too broad and overwhelming and complex. And so trying to find that right balance is incredibly difficult, and people aren't known for nuance, right? Like, there's just nuance escapes humanity every single minute, right? Every single second. Like, we're struggling with nuance. And so I think we can find a way to communicate this more effectively, but also we have to acknowledge the fact that, hey, it's inherently, at least certain aspects of it, certain framings of the meta-crisis are inherently very difficult to grasp, and that's, you know, again, inherent to it, not necessarily the result of poor communication.
James, as a student of this concept, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I actually think that, okay, it is inherently complex, but let's also consider the education system, as we all probably went through it, conditions us to think in a certain way. And maybe that is in no small part why we find these topics so difficult to digest and understand. And maybe de-educating and deconditioning yourself out of that way of thinking and beginning to think in a new way, maybe that makes these inherently complex topics that bit more digestible.
What I mean, what do you mean by that? Like, did you go through the public school system in Ireland?
Yeah.
So how were you taught, and what are you missing in this, like, broad stroke approach that the Irish public school system took in rearing you?
Yeah, so I'd say we're taught in such a way as to, it's with an eye to becoming some sort of a specialist or a reductionist. It's not with an eye to developing your holistic, big picture view of the world and how all these different things interact and interrelate. And so that's the sort of conditioning I'm talking about. Maybe if that wasn't the case, and we went through not even a different education system, because as soon as I say education system, it invokes certain ideas in people's minds. So if we were just left alone and developed as we saw fit, as the adults around us, them saw fit, and the adults around us, kids, they will have taught us things about the environment they were in that was apt to the environment, that actually applied. And it wasn't this sort of the education system in the way it is now.
But in the fact that you have sought out like alternative and or continuing forms of education as an adult, and that you have structured your life to pursue a third path away from what was laid out to you in Ireland right now. I know we've talked offline about your plans to move to another country to pursue an alternative career path. Is that not a testament to the value of that system to a certain extent?
That is a great question, and I often ask myself why. How is it that I ended up here pursuing these topics? But not many people do. So, what is it different about my developmental pathway or my innate cognition? I don't know what it is that made me end up where I am, pursuing the things I am. It's a good question, and I actually don't know.
You're just built different.
and I think maybe it speaks volumes to the good old Irish system of teaching their young. I don't know. I think I understand.
But no, that wouldn't make sense because most Irish people don't do this.
But Irish people do something else. Like everybody makes a choice at some point, right?
What are you implying, Andre?
He's still trying to get us to do the Catholic Church.
Yes. No, I guess what I'm saying is, and maybe we're just getting like completely like microscopic here, but maybe what let me emphasize a good quality public school education. And I think it's fucking hilarious that like we're representing a whole bunch of like school systems and a whole bunch of different like experiences, but a good.
I was homeschooled.
Well, that explains things. Yeah. But no, I'm joking. No. I think homeschooling is a great alternative too. But a good, well-rounded education will equip somebody with the curiosity and confidence to pursue a path. Not every path that everybody else takes, but also a path that fits them well. So if somebody makes the decision to become a baker or a banker or whatever, it's because they have determined through their own process of critical thought that is the path they're setting out on, independent of what people say or what they might view that decision as, or is that like complacency or is that not? I think that is ultimately speaking the goal of these kinds of programs, is to equip somebody to make a decision in their life. And
you want to empower. Yeah, you want education to empower people intellectually and economically or whatever, like life decision wise.
Correct. And I think that is already the foundation that we can work with to start furthering conversations around things like the Metacrisis, right? If maybe invest more into that, focus more into that, and develop. Because Livon, ultimately speaking, I agree with you that I think things have gotten worse. And even seeing like the school system that I graduated out of, it has declined in quality, and that's because there is something going on, at least in the United States, with regards to how the country perceives the value of like a public school. Right.
Well, also standardized testing and
all of that,
like teaching for testing. Like, there's so many problems.
So instead, why not focus again to the point James made? Why not focus on what we have and what people know? Focus on reforming it and make that like day zero of whatever Metacrisis movement is. That we acknowledge that we need to improve education for the current and future generations, because only through a well-developed mind could you then start pursuing solutions to these existential threats we face. And again, I think this is what I'm like firmly agreeing with James on, is that we really don't need to be reinventing the wheel here, because a lot of the bones are already laid. We just need to pay a little bit more attention to them and be a little bit more intentional about how we fund and leverage some of these assets that are already laid out before us. And, in this simulated conversation, let's say if we came out of all this agreed that, okay, for the first step is to reinvest and refocus our attention on public schooling that's accessible to everybody and that is of a high quality. Okay, we can work with that as an objective. We can organize people to get involved in their school boards, organize people to lobby their government to fund, local school districts better, et cetera, et cetera. We don't even need to call this like, oh, we're trying to build up to a third attractor system. It could be agnostic of all of that, knowing full well that the products of these sorts of well-invested systems will ultimately speaking seek out solutions to the existential threats humanity faces. Boom, done.
Yeah, I think this movement, it needs to be more concrete. I mean, we just talked about how it was maybe too vague or whatever. And part of that, I think, is is having a concrete goal that any chapter could start out. Maybe that's like the default goal, right? Like, sure, you have something that is more directly related to your local community,
Yeah.
but that is a default starting point. Like, hey, see what you can do about the education system, and at a minimum, try to provide, basic education, or I don't know, some sort of good messaging on that front. So people then vote people in that would make those changes, or something of that nature. But have a concrete goal focused on education is a great way to bring this down to earth, I think.
100% agreed. 100%.
And so actually, let me ask you this. So we've kind of, it seems like all conversations, all roads lead back down to education, right? Then by focusing on other things, are you now being less effective? Or can we actually do things in parallel? Because there's something to be said about, like, hey, what if this movement, instead of being decentralized, or maybe it's still somewhat decentralized, but it is now intentionally focused on revamping education systems worldwide. Like, education is the thing that you need to reform so that anything else can be done properly, right? Any of these other objectives that we have regarding the meta crisis can be implemented. Is it better to put all your eggs in one basket in this particular case, is the question.
I guess it depends on how you're trying to reform education. I think it's important to figure that out. Like I said earlier, I think focusing just on education reform of public school systems is only a part of the picture. I think just like if you can accomplish the same thing faster, you should do that. So if we can also focus on marketing the message and getting more people's eyeballs on the problem and on ways of thinking that are more effective, I think that is an important thing that you can't leave out. Because otherwise you're just waiting a few generations, like you said, Levon.
Yeah, well, I think certain people will be drawn to certain aspects of this whole meta-crisis issue, and whichever one speaks most loudly to you, dive in. If it's education for you, go for it. If it's
That's a
marketing,
good point.
go for it.
No, that's a good point, James, because we've got a bell curve distribution of different preferences that people have, and not everyone's going to, actually education's probably not going to be on the top of most people's list, right? But maybe someone is interested in regenerative farming. Maybe someone is interested in, economic reforms or political campaign reforms, whatever. Like, I think, the more I think about it, like, maybe keep it decentralized, allow that freedom and flexibility, but maybe having a default as an education system is not a bad start to it.
Because and I think maybe it's like a multi-layered approach where if you have back to this question of like, how would this kind of movement be governed if you had a nerve center, like a nucleus? I think, James, is like the terminology used. The nucleus is going to have something that it aligns behind, because the nucleus needs to be doing something. And much like the UN, as ineffective as it is, I think every year the UN has like a purpose, right? Where it's like the year of like anti-diabetes or some shit. Where they adapt like a lasered focus, like guiding light for their organization to ultimately fail to meet. But at least they're failing in a targeted manner, right?
At least they're failing in a targeted manner.
We can applaud that.
What a glowing review for the United Nations.
right.
They're failing, but at least they know what they're failing at.
Where's the meta treaty model when you need it?
UN year of. This year it is currently, what the fuck? It's the International Year of Camelids?
Whoa, that's cool.
Well, no one.
Camelids? I don't even know this word.
Llamas, alpacas.
Well, no wonder they're not getting anything done.
They're focused on llamas and alpacas.
What the shit?
You can't make this shit up.
We truly live in the strangest timeline.
This might just be the agricultural agency. This might just be that would make sense.
Okay. I mean, even then, that's
Even
like
that's
out of
still, like-
every agricultural issue you could choose to make the theme of a calendar
No,
year
this
for a
shit
global
is
organization.
literally on the United Nations page. The Year of Camelids.
No way. Okay.
Like this
Is this like a Chinese New Year type thing? Maybe they're just like, haha, this is a cute thing, or is this actually a policy?
But
Focus?
next year we'll have peace and trust, glacier preservation, cooperatives. Man, they have a lot of shit going for 2025. Maybe it's just like they break it down a
That's
quarter.
a huge divergence from camel.
It is, yeah.
What the shit?
Yeah. So anyone scared of a one world government? No needs to worry at this point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll be spending our time like.
Maybe
Bowing
the
down
llamas.
to-
Maybe
Yeah.
the
Milking
llamas
camels.
need to worry. But yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was gonna be like, I don't know, like women in government or something. Nah, they're like
Nah, it's the camelids.
If you could please link to that in the video description, Andre.
Yeah.
celebrating the
That's-
International Year of Camelids. Yeah.
That'll be in the show notes. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's
Yeah.
try to wrap this up. Final comments from everyone. Maybe James, you can start us off.
Final comment. Yeah, I think you spoke to it there with the various different aspects of the metacrisis that you want to focus on. For some people, education; for others, agriculture; for others, marketing. That is, but the point is that each of those people, whether you're the agriculturalist, the marketer, or the educator, you all hold like a basic, broad understanding of the metacrisis that you're trying to address, that you're engaged in a certain aspect of, but you have a deeper knowledge in one of those three, for example. So I guess that is what I'd like to end with. It's people who are engaged in the world in these activities that are related to the metacrisis, that all hold a broad understanding of the metacrisis, but go deep on whatever aspect speaks most loudly to them.
Yeah, I love that.
Mhm.
Alex?
Yeah, I'll just jumping off from what James said. I think it's important to get these people talking to each other. I did a cursory search for metacrisis discussion groups and forums. I found a couple like resources, but no platform where people who are interested in this can specifically talk about this. Like this general issue of the metacrisis and what to do about it. So I'd be interested in hearing from the comment section if anyone would be interested in a platform like a Discord server where people who want to talk about the metacrisis can specifically come together for that and discuss what should be done.
Okay. It's good.
Maybe
Andre?
we need a subreddit or something.
I think, yeah, there already is a Metacrisis subreddit,
Lame.
but there's no.
I have no confidence.
Yeah.
but there's
Reddit-
no-
Reddit-
There's one person, and I think it's like my account.
Yeah. So, Reddit is great for like shooting the shit kind of discussion. Discord is great for targeted discussions because you can thread things out. You can have video chats.
Yeah.
It allows for much more
Mm.
hands-on interactivity with the topic.
I think there is, Alex. The Great Simplification has a Discord. I don't know if it's
Yes, I joined the Great Simplification Discord, but it doesn't strike me as a place that's specifically about the metacrisis. Am I
No.
incorrect?
I'm not sure. I haven't really explored it all that much, but I'd imagine on the sidebar there's like a metacrisis topic. That's a prediction I'm making.
Well, so maybe people can check that out. Obviously, people want to learn more about the metacrisis in a higher technical level. Feel free to Google Schmachtenberger, check out all his work. Nate Hagens has a great podcast, The Great Simplification. But I would say right now, probably the most important thing everyone can do, something they can take home, is the will to click on that subscribe button and just stay up to date with all the Metacrisis news. It's going to be right here on Radius of Reason.
Yeah,
The Metacrisis News Network.
imminent.
But
That's good.
Yeah. I mean, that's all we have. I'm sure we'll continue discussing this. James, Alex, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. James, good luck in your travels.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Stay safe out there.
Will do. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It was good fun.
Thank you, guys. Adios.